Like the thousands who came to Camp Jackson, Camp Sevier, and Camp Wadsworth, Norman Rockwell arrived at the Charleston Navy Yard in the summer of 1917. Rockwell was already a well-known illustrator. The Navy had no intention of treating him like a regular recruit. Little did they know that keeping him away from the action would put him at risk of dying from Spanish influenza. Rockwell was assigned to boost morale by creating cartoons for the Navy newspaper and by painting officers' portraits. He was also allowed to continue his professional work. In his autobiography, Rockwell recounts catching the flu and being sent away from the base hospital back to his barracks. The doctor told him, "Get out of here. This place will kill you. The germs are as thick as blackstrap molasses."
There are various theories on how the flu epidemic began. And one of the most popular ones right now is that it got started in Kansas, at Camp Fenston, in February of 1918, where you had a large concentration of men next to huge livestock holes that were needed for the military.
The flu epidemic probably came through the military training bases as people were shuffled in and out. And of course what was interesting is this influenza really struck more the group that you think was the healthiest. People in their late teens and early 20s and 30s, the sort of, the go-to-war kind of young men and women. That was the group that seemed to be hit the hardest. But of course that was also the group that was congregating the most, whether it was in colleges or whether it was in the workforce or whether it was in the military.
The doctors didn't know what to do, the nurses, and everyone's focus had to be on trying to find a way to help the sick. And those helping the sick, many of them came down with the same disease. So even while this was going on, the government, President Wilson and his medical advisors didn't pay attention to it, didn't feel that this was as extreme as it was turning out to be. And so they continued to allow infected men, many of whom at the time didn't show symptoms, they allowed them to go overseas to be transported to other camps. And of course, this quickly spread the disease.
In fact, there was a horrible little song that became popular at this time about, I had a little bird, his name was Enza, I opened the cage and influenza. I mean, it's just, people were, don't ask me why it's a popular song given the tens of thousands of Americans who died, but that was sort of the beginning of the jazz age, the Roaring '20s. People were, looking at things in a different way.
By September of 1918, the flu had arrived full force in South Carolina, making its way from military camps into towns and rural areas.
And it came on so quickly. This wasn't something that, you were all right and then you didn't feel good and then you didn't feel better, worse, and then it sort of dragged. But within 2 or 3 days, it was a full-fledged case. And then it took a really long time for many people to recuperate from it, 3, 4, 5 weeks.
It was a high fever that reached 105, 106 degrees, led to pneumonia, which developed all this phlegm in the lungs, and it often people drowned in their own phlegm because all of what this pneumonia did. And you would hear reports of people turning blue, their lips blue, their extremities blue, because the oxygen wasn't able, they couldn't get the oxygen to their bodies and they literally drowned.
Hospitals were rare in those days. Many local doctors had enlisted, and with no drugs to treat the Spanish influenza, the few doctors left in South Carolina could provide little help.
More than a few cases, many families, the entire family came down with the flu, and there was no one to look after them. So you can imagine what the state of the household would be in that case. And they survived or died based on, their own constitution.
They said that the caskets would come in on the train from Camp Sevier and were piled at the railroad station on Washington Street, ready to be shipped elsewhere. People dressed in black. I mean, it was bad enough that the war was going on in Europe, and the same month that it was hitting so hard at home, that's the month of the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, of massive assaults in France, and tremendous numbers of men killed there too. So you're getting it from both ends. The horrors in France paralleled by the horrors here.
Quarantined, some kept busy making masks to contain the flu. A nation stretched thin by war faced the dual challenge of fighting a deadly battle both in Europe and on the home front.
Well, it was desperate. The community didn't have the personnel to build the coffins, to take the bodies out of the households, at least in the peak period of the disease. And stories here, other places in the state, in the nation, are of the dead lying in bed for days before people discovered that they had passed away and they could remove them. It was, pretty smelly, pretty desperate, grim place to be.
Because of the flu epidemic, almost 6 times as many Americans died on the home front as died fighting the war. Across South Carolina, an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people died in a 2-month period.
In the world, it's very much more difficult because it affected just about every place in the world, and keeping records was a lot less. It wasn't done very well in certainly the third world like Africa. But one estimate throwing out is something like 20 to 25 million people died worldwide.
People thought they were experiencing the Black Plague again, and there was great fear because they didn't quite understand what was going on, and it was just a truly terrible time. If you go in old cemeteries and you walk around, and you'll see a number of gravestones, just the sheer number that have the death dates being 1918, and it was during the influenza pandemic.
Norman Rockwell was, of course, one of the lucky ones. Despite being 17 pounds underweight when he joined the Navy, Rockwell recovered fully, just in time for the armistice.